Niki Wakefield ahau, he uri no whāngarei, te rohe o whāngarei, mihi ana kia koutou katoa. Very glad to be here today to share, to give insights and to offer up something for our Pākehī Māori who are doing amazing things across the motu. No taitoki reo ahau, I am based here in Whangarei, and my presentation today will largely speak from a Whangarei perspective, but hopefully be relevant for everyone in their mahi in Pākehī that interacts with te taiao. A little bit of false advertising perhaps. I will be taking a lot of time to really focus on environmental management generally, the role of Pākehī Māori in the long restoration journey and recovery from the impacts of environmental degradation, and how that crosses over with the many breaches of te tiriti o Waitangi. Shall we hit it? Happy to pause for questions at the end, and welcome those questions too. Ko waio, I think maybe a bit of a CV or some context as to my relevance on this topic. I'm a hapu member here in Whangarei, and that's been quite an interesting professional journey. Travelled to Waikato University, the distant city of Kirikiriroa, for my university degree, but then came home. My nan was unwell. I had started masters in ecological genetics after a bachelor's degree in science, and then I kind of clicked. I was like, how can I go home if I'm an expert in genetics? How will that be relevant in taitoki? And so I took a bit of a mode switch into environmental education, working with schools, and what that also led to was a lot of taiao restoration work with community groups, with our whānau all over Taitokerau, for the water mostly, our coastal and freshwater environments. But yeah, heaps of riparian planting and things like that, at a time where people were, I think, for the first time really clicking on that what we do on the land impacts the waters, the harbour, the fisheries, and how the water connects us all. Very formative for me as a young person, but really was realising as well that the other elements of injustice, not just to the environment, but to our people, tangata whenua of Aotearoa, I was a bit kuari on that and took a job with our Waitangi tribunal claimants, which was where I really got my education in the many crown breaches of te tiriti, and how the misuse of power has really shaped the world we live in today. So big disclaimer, I'm not a planner. I'm not an environmental lawyer. Those skills are where the technical analysis and strengths in interpreting our regulatory kāwanatanga environment today rest, and there's many wonderful kaikōrero on that can do the deep dive. Rather today, I'm speaking as a hapu member who is also works in Pākehī Māori. I'm the director of a small company, 12 employees doing kaimahi, doing mahi mo te taiao, and but also with that ongoing obligation and duty towards our hapu, and progressing the restoration of our connection to our whenua. So it's a bit broad today, my kōrero, and we'll touch on RMA as well, but there's lots to talk about on that matter. So mihi ana kia koutou. Our context is pretty extreme. That environmental context which we interact as Pākehī Māori, as community members, as whānau, is not just one of environmental degradation. What I would like to propose for us all to look at in our mahi as Pākehī Māori is how land alienation, tāhae whenua, the many crown breaches of Te Tiriti that have cut Te Ao Māori away from the whenua and its management really shapes us in our communities today. Tai Tokiro, you know, is perceived as one of the regions with the highest Māori population. We also have some really progressive local government currently in the far north. You know, many look to Tai Tokiro as a very Māori place. But I would just like to disrupt that perception a little bit for us who live and work here. At this part of Tai Tokiro, the whāngarei end of it, where land alienation has left somewhat of a desert of Te Ao Māori. Over the last 200 years, or slightly less, since before the signing of Te Tiriti, environmental degradation has occurred hand in hand with colonisation and land alienation. Tāhae whenua, raupatu, many would call it. And to my, you know, in my worldview, I see Pākehī Māori, hapori Māori, Māori communities as an essential part to the reconnecting and restoration from these injustices. On the map here, you're seeing a bit of a loop there. There's a QR code you can click on to have a tutu with this map yourself, which is a bit of a before and after shot of 1840, the lands in yellow being our treasure, our whenua, our tūranga waiwai as Māori. A bit of a before and after. 1840, you know, it was all Māori. All these lands were very Māori. And under the stewardship, kaitiakitanga, whichever kupu you use, of our tūpuna. And it really quickly changed here in Whangarei. There's other parts of Tai Tokiro as well, where extreme land alienation was felt very early on after the signing of Te Tiriti. And, you know, this is what we're left with today, at least in this part of the world, taku pito o te ao in Whangarei. So you still see the yellow there on the map, but and little red triangles, they're showing our marae scattered across the north. And it's really dense in places, and I mihi to our whanaunga who retained their rohe pōtai and resisted those land alienation systems. I look to the north, which is also a hot seat of te reo Māori and thriving arts. But then I look to those big empty patches without the yellow, without the little red triangles showing marae. And I'm aroha for those places because they were also places of significance, you know, kāinga, economic activity of our tūpuna, and we're somewhat deleted from those places. So while, you know, parts of Tai Tokiro still has, you know, 6-8% of the district in whenua Māori today, and I mihi to all our haukāinga who are looking after those pieces. My proposition today is that as Pākehī Māori, we have an interesting and different obligation to those areas that we touch in our operations, our activities, that maybe the tangata whenua of that place have been deleted or cancelled from those landscapes. And they're not present in those communities anymore due to these extreme alienations. So mihi to our kaipara whānau also, huge impact over there. Looking to the north of Whangarei City, Hukirangi, all the way over to Pipiwai, big patches of emptiness there. And to the south of Whangarei, Bream Bay, through Mangawhai, huge areas of land alienation. And so I look at us who are maybe conducting some business activities in that area, maybe some tile restoration or some contracting, taking pictures, doing content creation, all of that diversity that's out there in Pākehā Māori land. It's always on my mind, what is our obligation? What is my obligation when I'm doing things on these lands that have been heavily alienated? Moving on, linking that to the environmental degradation part. This image here is of the Hukarangi Repo, the second largest wetland in the southern hemisphere, flowing into what is the second largest harbour of the southern hemisphere, the Kaipara Moana. The entire catchment of the northern Wairoa River, which flows through Dargaville, Tunatahi, out into the Kaipara Moana. The catchment of the northern Wairoa makes up 29% of Taitokiro. What we do on the lands in that 29% has huge impact on the ongoing challenges of Kaipara Moana. As a hapu member of Ngāti Hau, Ngāti Kahua Torongari, this is our challenge. The Hukarangi Repo and surrounding areas where the wetland has been drained, converted to really profitable, intensive farming. Definitely alienated. We're not occupants in what was a giant food basket of the north, and playing our part for everyone upstream and downstream of what is something really devastating that's happening in the Hukarangi swamp. 6,000 hectares of drained wetland, a few little remnant pockets, which is cool, of what the wetland that was there before, the habitat for the tuna, that was our economy and our tino manaakitanga of our tribes around here, which are also in decline. For generations now, our hapu have fought, have stayed present, have retained relationships in the Hukarangi swamp, as challenging as that is, to make that incremental change to recover from one short generation of land clearance and drainage. Some insight here, using Hukarangi as an example, the farms, the lands that we see there now, only 60 years ago were manuka scrub and deep peat, soaked in water. A bit of a filter, a bit of a water purifier as the water ran down off the hills of the upper catchments as far as Te Rua Pika Pika, and down into what is the 6,000 hectares of the repo, filtering that water before it leaves and travels down. Today, there's a drainage scheme there, 6 large impeller pumps that cut tuna every time they get turned on into perfectly sized little portions. Our tuna whakaheke, tons and tons of tuna heading out to sea for their breeding. They need to meet up somewhere over Tonga. We don't know exactly where. The tuna need to head over there en masse at the same time to spawn. It's a really fragile process of the tuna life cycle. And as they head out to sea, they've got to make it past all of these barriers, all of these challenges. The tuna we see in our awa today, many will say there's so many tuna, nothing to worry about. But the tuna we see there today, they swam up these rivers to grow big and fat, 20, 30, even 80 years ago. So the large tuna we're seeing today, they came up into these habitats before the repo was drained, before the hydro station was put in potentially. And they've been, doing their thing. But it's when they head out to sea that they're being impacted. It's a big mamae for our hapu here of the upper Kaipara in northern Wairua River. The floodwaters that sit there, even with the pumps, they can't get the water away fast enough. And the water sits there for 3, 5, 7 days sometimes, depending on how big the storm is. And it sits there going a bit septic. It goes green, it loses all of its oxygen. And as the water is pumped off those paddocks out on their way back down to the kaipara, the water is depleted of oxygen. And so it's not just in the Ripo that we're seeing this, really hard time for our freshwater taonga species. It's downstream as well. We feel a huge sense of duty and obligation to the Ripo. But what does that look like? And how do we recover? How do we recover from that? It's a big job. But also the dairy solids off the Hukirangi swamp are 15% of Whangarei's GDP. Huge amount of dairy solids coming off the Hukirangi Ripo, supporting our local economy. So how can we convert? How can we change? How can we use the land more appropriately? This is a big pātai many of our hapu are facing as they're reconnecting and trying to look after these lands that have been alienated. Again, how do we fit in that as Pākehī Māori? I'm just keen to give another example, a less rural example for, again, in our whāngarei context of that land alienation and how it's linked with environmental degradation. Whāngarei CBD that we see today is the result, or a lot of the footprint, is from 2 land alienations from before Te Tiriti was even signed. It's definitely dodgy. Our tupuna didn't agree to it. In fact, when it went in front of the Crown's Commission to investigate pre-treaty land claims, our tupuna were not in agreement with what the settlers of Mea and Kefla were saying the deal was. Regardless, the Crown's Commission of Inquiry awarded those 2 settlers portions of land far greater than even they had asked for. And those lands are now Te Kipunga, all the way through into Whangarei CBD. And that's where our city has been built. And our tupuna hugely alienated. We're really not even on the fringes of Whangarei CBD today in whenua Māori. Land reclamation is a really big part of these impacts. Each parcel of land we're looking at here on this 1965 map of Whangarei, the upper Whangarei harbour, was slowly converted, drained, reclaimed, tahuna, or places of gathering on the edges of the harbour. They were really popular places up until we built roads everywhere. This was the last of where our tupuna gathered up until the 1900s in the middle of the screen there, now called Hihiawa or Lower Dent Street or Herekino Avenue. But it was here that in 1906, tupuna of that time protested, petitioned the government to stop bulldozing us off our last little bit of whenua in Taki Taimoana, where we lived, gathered, had get-togethers, prepared ourselves for the Native Land Court, hosted visitors into the area. While it was, some claim a sandbank, it was our last little footprint in what is now the Whangarei CBD. And it was through the Harbour Board that last little bit was taken without compensation. And also, our tupuna were bulldozed. Their whare were bulldozed off the last bits of land that sat there above the tidal mark. And today, since then, it's really been the economic hub of not only Whangarei, but also wider Taitokiro. Regional development has heavily relied on ports, you know, the export of goods, the importing of goods, the boating industry is a big part of our whāngarei story today. And all of that was built on lands that our tupuna were bulldozed off in the, you know, and then reclamation and pā sites destroyed to really reclaim the lands. Interestingly, in that photo as well, to the right of where I was pointing out is today's now closed but very large landfill from that era as well. And that landfill started in the 60s. You can kind of see it in the area there. And over time, it built up over the reclaimed lands and marine takutai moana that was filled in. And now it's a really popular walking track, the loop we call it, and it's a place of huge recreation. Now it's no longer used as a landfill, but those toxic legacies remain and continue to impact our takutai moana, the kai moana of Whangarei Harbour, the water quality. I don't know if you want to jump in puddles over there at Pohe Island whānau, because that landfill is still having problems today. But I really wanted to give this as context because it's not just, you know, rural areas that environment or in dock reserves that we can consider this environmental degradation. It's in our cities, it's on our streets, it's in our urban environments as well, that there's some ongoing duty for all of us to consider. And how do we deal with that? Yeah, just to help, this is a bit of a before and after. So before, you know, as the reclamation is occurring, but this map here can also show or give some demonstration as to the size and scale of lands taken without compensation. And now, you know, really hubs of economic activity in our cities. This story isn't unique to Whangarei. I'm mihi to our whanaunga of Ngāti Onioni, also seeking the return of harbourboard lands in Gisborne at this time. A few of those strategies that the Crown used, you know, they started before, there were these old land claims, and then after Te Tiriti was signed, 1840, the Crown had only the Crown could purchase, all the Crown's delegated companies could purchase land from our tupuna. And by purchase, I'm going to put that in brackets, to acquire land, because today many agree, including the Crown and the Waitangi Tribunal, that every legislation created to alienate lands from Māori were breaches of Te Tiriti. So we can call it all stolen land, but there's some really extreme examples of stolen land too, such as the public works or harbour boards lands taken no compensation, things like that. But again, what do we, you know, this context, how is it relevant for us today in the reforms, the extreme and high impact reforms being led out by the coalition government of Kāwanatanga today? There's some familiar themes. It's almost like we're looking at the same strategies sometimes of the 1860s and beyond, where strategies are put in place to put pressure and duress on all who seek to do environmental restoration or restoration of tangata whenua to their whenua across the motu. It's true, the Crown has already agreed. They said, oh yeah, definitely, we left Whangarei virtually landless. We agree with this. So, you know, that's quite nice to hear as descendants of this type of injustice today. We're like, yay, the Crown agrees, and they want to start a discussion about what to do about that. Here in Whangarei and the rest of the whare tapu o Ngāpuhi, we're pre-treaty settlement, and we're yet to have that discussion on how these issues can be addressed. But in other parts of the country, you know, there's legislation in place that also agrees with these effects, these deletist effects of the Crown on our whenua, our connection to place, and our ability to look after things, such as te taiao. Yeah, it's a general statement. Some may not agree. I know this it's a statement that offends many, but there is plenty of evidence to say that every parcel of land that was alienated before 1992 was through breaches of Te Tiriti. And, shorthand for that, for me, stolen land. The map again, but we can skip that. You get the picture. So today we have these reforms all around us. And what has that got to do with us as Pākehī Māori? There's a broad spectrum of Pākehī Māori out there, but I imagine a lot of our listeners to this webinar have some kind of role in environmental management, perhaps, or intersect with the RMA, or maybe professionals in the RMA. And I'm not going to bring any new information to those who are already well practiced in the delivery of the RMA. But these reforms absolutely are broad, and through the removal of Te Tiriti or the watering down of Te Tiriti in these legislative reforms currently, we're absolutely stymieing progress of both hapu reconnection to whenua, hapu tangata whenua, iwi reconnection to whenua, but also our ability as Pākehī Māori to do better. The RMA was the topic of this talk, and I will focus on it a little bit just to show how broad and high impact the reforms are. But I really wanted to shine a light on the many other reforms. 3 Waters was a biggie. It became insanely unpopular at the last election. Co-governance became a dirty word. But what the water services reform was seeking to achieve was workforce reform, was the ability for local business, for businesses with a social lens, for businesses with local ability to grow and to meet the water services needs of their local area, to be part of the delivery of that. I really am pouty that that reform did not continue as it was. For me, it wasn't about co-governance. It was about training and workforce development for me as a hapu member of whāngarei. And so that reform and what it's turned into now, which does not compel the owners of water assets and infrastructure to speak to Māori at all or take us into account, whether we are the iwi of the place or the Māori community, is a huge backstep, even from the system we had before. At least before we had local government required to consider community needs and deliver on those 4 well-beings, local government that was running water services before. The current legislation, the Local Waters Done Good reform that's underway right now, is very explicit in that it doesn't require these local government groups that own and manage water assets to even have a conversation or have input from community as well as Māori community or their treaty partners or relationship holders in their area. So really high impact, and it's happening right now. Resource Management Act, very scary. It's a beast, it's huge, and it is also, over the last 28 years, been an area of huge progress in environmental law and in Māori environmental law. It's seen amazing progress in understandings of and implication of tikanga and law. The RMA, right through to the Environment Court and beyond, for those who have big take that they need to take to the higher courts, the RMA has given us so much progress, really detailed. I'll go to that on the next slide. Local government reform is happening now, taking out the 4 well-beings, which compel councils to talk to us as the treaty partners. All of these provisions are on the chopping block. Conservation and Wildlife Acts are also under review, enabling use of Crown-owned land currently sitting in the conservation portfolio and removing barriers to economic land use on those areas. And look, that might be an okay thing. We might have tourism, we might have the ability to build Pākehī Māori on the conservation and wildlife conservation estate. That could be a good news thing in some areas. But in other areas, well, for myself, on my end of the spectrum on that, we absolutely worry that these alienations are going to again privilege non-Māori and certainly not progress the return of those lands to those who they were ultimately stolen from. 34% of Aotearoa katoa sits in dock hands. It's a huge area that we're talking about that are subject to these reforms. The regulatory, regulatory system was a tricky one for many, round 2 of the Treaty Principles Bill. But what that really proposed to do was to constrain any lawmakers of the future from considering te tiriti and even doing analysis on te tiriti in relationships and impact of new regulations and new legislation. Huge backslide from where we're at today. Hauora, I really want to talk about the hauora reforms underway and how they've been ground to a halt, how we've got a health system in crisis, and the huge impact that has on many aspects of Pākehī Māori and Hapori Māori. And our health outcomes is obviously a key story, but what about our ability to deliver, to innovate, and to offer hauora service provision, systems design from a Te Ao Māori worldview? All of that is grinding to a halt currently, or being underinvested. Our employment services, so there's work going on to have huge impact on workers' rights. And as an employer, you might be like, yay, less union action against me. Or as a kaimahi, or those who want to see best practice pastoral care for their kaimahi, these back steps are impacting those who we work with, perhaps as Pākehī Māori, in the way that they value their kaimahi. Where do we fit again? I'll keep asking that question because we've got this context of tino rangatiratanga and kāwanatanga. Kāwanatanga is rolling out these reforms, but where do we sit as Pākehī Māori, perhaps in the regulatory environment? And we see ourselves firmly as a limited liability company under the kāwanatanga turi, or a charity, or all of these things to do what we do. But it's an ongoing question if tino rangatiratanga indeed was not ceded by the tūpuna to kāwanatanga, where do we fit as Pākehī Māori? It's a bit of a tricky question for many of us as well. So I just want to keep putting that on the table. I'm going to skip these slides because we're running out of time. RMA reforms, really big changes, a lot of unfamiliar and new language, and a new watering down of the local detail that are in the rules of how we use the whenua and the water, and how we can develop and what we can do where under those rules. They'll be put into regional spatial plans, and that's a really interesting prospect. It sounds kind of cool to me because I'm like, yeah, we get to put everything on a map and tell everyone what's appropriate to do on the whenua. But that's going hand in hand with the removal of any aspects of co-design of these regional spatial plans with tangata whenua. So we're all going to be left a little bit in the dark, perhaps, if this reform heads in that direction. But it's huge impact. There's just a few examples of all of these national direction things. that impact the way the construction industry works, that impacts the way the whenua is used, of course. The list goes on. There's like way more electricity, whether we're getting more solar or less solar. The way we manage Indigenous biodiversity on every bit of whenua we work on, what activities we can undertake in the coastal marine environment. All of these things are under review with a lens of enabling economic use, less restriction, and deleting te tiriti. So it's an area of big concern for those of us in hapu RMA land. Time is of the essence. I'm going to stop there and pause for pātai. But I really just wanted to keep posing those questions to us all as Pākehā Māori, where we fit in taiao restoration, but as well the restoration of tangata whenua to the whenua that they've been alienated from. Ko mutu tira, but mihi ana ki a koutou katoa, and happy to share some whakaaro today.